You're listening to ESSENTFLOW by Intentional by Shay, a clarity-led podcast for creators who are done building on confusion and ready to grow sustainably. I'm Shay, a mindful brand strategist and consultant, and the creator of ESSENTFLOW. Here, we don't chase consistency for the sake of it. We align identity, messaging, and systems first, because clarity always comes before consistency. This is the space where strategy meets intention and growth finally makes sense. So take a breath with me, get grounded, and let's flow into this week's episode. Welcome back, loves. You're listening to ESSENTFLOW by Intentional by Shay, a clarity-led space where strategy becomes practice and growth is allowed to move at a pace that actually honors your life. Again, I'm Shay, a mindful brand strategist and consultant, the creator of ESSENTFLOW. I help creators align identity, messaging, and systems so that they can build sustainable brands with clarity before consistency. And today's conversation sits directly on the other side of the last one. In the previous episode, we talked about what it looks like to move from force to flow, about naming the moment when pushing stops working, and why so many of us were never meant to grow through pressure in the first place. That episode wasn't just an emotional reflection. It was a threshold, a recognition that something old had run its course. But once you stop forcing, a new question always follows. Now what? Because flow doesn't mean floating aimlessly. It doesn't mean giving up on discipline, commitment, or showing up. And it definitely doesn't mean doing less just for the sake of doing less. But what it does mean is that the order changes. If you are truly moving from force to flow, there is something you have to understand before you try to be consistent again. And that is clarity has to come first. Not clarity as perfection, not clarity as having it all figured out, but clarity as orientation. Because consistency without clarity isn't alignment. It's pressure in disguise. And that's what we're unpacking today. Now, somewhere along the way, consistency became the virtue creators were told to chase above all else. Post consistently, show up consistently, stay visible, don't fall off, don't disappear, don't lose momentum, don't lose relevance. And on the surface, that advice sounds responsible, strategic even. But what often gets lost in that conversation is what we're being asked to be consistent with, and whether it actually makes sense for who we are and the season we're in. Because consistency isn't neutral. Consistency amplifies whatever you build it on. When it's built on clarity, it creates momentum that feels supportive. When it's built on confusion, it creates exhaustion. And when it's built on misalignment, it slowly turns into a form of self-abandonment that looks productive on the outside and draining on the inside. This is where so many creators get stuck, and not because they lack discipline or desire. They get stuck because they're trying to show up repeatedly for something they don't fully understand yet. They're asking themselves to commit to a rhythm, a message, a strategy, or an identity that hasn't been clarified. Repetition without understanding doesn't mean or feel grounding. It feels heavy. And heaviness is usually the first signal that clarity was skipped. Most of us were taught to treat resistance as a character flaw. If something feels hard, we assume we're lazy. If motivation drops, we assume we need more accountability. If consistency wavers, we assume we're not cut out for this. But resistance is rarely the problem. More often, resistance is information. It's the body saying, I don't know what I'm being asked to repeat yet. It's the nervous system saying, this place doesn't match the context. It's the intuition saying, something here hasn't been fully named. Without clarity, consistency becomes mechanical. You show up because it's on the calendar. You post because you said you would. You keep going because stopping feels like failure. I want you to sit with that just for a moment. Because it's true. You continue to keep going because stopping feels like failure. Not because what you're doing actually fits your life. And that's how creators end up being incredibly consistent at things that quietly wear them down. They build routines that look impressive from the outside but feel wrong internally. They commit to systems that assume a capacity they don't currently have. They stay loyal to versions of themselves they've already outgrown. And when it all becomes unsustainable, they turn that frustration inward instead of questioning the framework they were trying to live inside. This isn't a discipline problem. It's a clarity problem. And clarity problems cannot be solved by trying harder. They can only be solved by slowing down long enough to understand the context you're operating in, emotionally, energetically, creatively, and seasonally, before you decide how often and how intensely you're going to show up. Here's the strategist truth that changes everything. Consistency is not the starting point of growth. There, I said it. Again, consistency is not the starting point of growth. It's a multiplier. It magnifies whatever foundation you place it on. I want you to think about that for a moment. It magnifies whatever foundation you place it on. So if you do not have a set foundation, you are magnifying what you don't have. And you end up burning out in the end. So before we talk about habits, routines, systems, or output, we have to ask a quieter question first. What actually deserves consistency from me right now? That question alone shifts growth out of pressure and into intention. It moves out of force and into flow, not because things suddenly become easy, but because they finally make sense. And when things make sense, your body stops fighting you. And that's where sustainable growth begins. So as you're listening, I want you to pause for a moment. And I want you to ask yourself these 3 questions. Where have I been trying to be consistent without feeling clear? What feels heavy, not because it's challenging, but because it's unclear? And what might change if I allowed myself to orient before I commit? Now, you don't need the answers just yet, but I just want you to notice and take note of your response. Clarity is one of those words we throw around in the creator space like everyone is supposed to know what it means. But when you sit with creators one-on-one, when you listen to their voice crack a little, when you hear the frustration behind their strategies, when you watch them try to hold themselves together while still trying to move forward, you tend to realize something pretty quickly. Most people think they don't have clarity because they've been looking for the wrong thing. Clarity has been marketed as certainty, as confidence, as a fully articulated plan, as a perfect brand statement you can wrap a bow around and present like a project for grading. And because we think clarity is supposed to feel like certainty, we assume we don't have it. But clarity is not certainty. I'm going to say that one more time for the people in the back. Clarity is not certainty. Certainty is a destination. Clarity is a direction. Certainty demands final answers. Clarity asks for honest starting points. Certainty wants proof. Clarity wants presence. And when you confuse the two, you will always feel like you're missing something, even when clarity is already showing up for you. Clarity, real clarity, doesn't usually announce itself with fireworks, confidence, or a bold declaration that you're finally ready. That's not how this works in real bodies, on real days, with real responsibilities and real emotions. Clarity is subtle before it's strong, soft before it's sharp, internal before it becomes external. It arrives quietly, often inconveniently, as a whisper instead of a roar. It'll tug at you. Something in this rhythm doesn't feel right anymore. I can't keep showing up this way. Something I used to force doesn't sit the same. I don't know what's next, but I know this isn't it. That is clarity. But most people dismiss it because it doesn't feel confident yet. They call it confusion, overwhelm, or just being stuck. But sometimes being stuck is just clarity without vocabulary. This is what I see constantly as a strategist. Creators feel unclear not because they don't know what they want, but because they're waiting for clarity to feel like certainty before they trust it. They want the full timeline, the roadmap, the blueprint, the guaranteed outcome, the assurance that this direction won't embarrass them, waste their time, or require them to pivot again. But clarity's job isn't to move or remove risk. Clarity's job is to reveal alignment. Clarity says, here's what's true for you right now. Here's what no longer fits. Here's what feels alive when you imagine it. Here's what drains you before you even begin. And here's where the energy is and where it isn't. And when you actually sit with that, when you stop demanding certainty long enough to notice clarity whispering underneath everything, something shifts, something changes, something loosens, and something exhales. Clarity becomes less about knowing the whole path and more about knowing what step makes the most sense right now. This is the part most people miss. Clarity is often emotional before it becomes strategic. Your body knows before your brain can articulate. Your reactions shift before your plans do. Your energy pulls away from what's misaligned before you consciously choose to let go. That's clarity. And that's ESSENTFLOW at its core. This is why when people say, I'm confused, and I ask, well, are you confused or are you resisting what you already know? Because confusion is often clarity we're scared to honor. We're scared to say something that doesn't fit because it used to. We're scared to release strategies that once worked and no longer do. We're scared to adjust our identity because we've invested too much in an older version of ourselves. We're scared to rebuild because the world praises consistency, not curiosity. But clarity is not concerned with optics. Clarity is concerned with alignment, and alignment is what makes consistency sustainable. Once you understand this, you start to notice clarity showing up in small spaces. When something feels heavy for no clear reason, when your creativity shuts down every time you revisit a certain project, when your body tightens at the thought of continuing an old routine, When your energy spikes at an idea you keep trying to ignore, and when excitement quietly replaces dread even before you tell anyone out loud, all of that is clarity. Not polished, packaged, pretty, but present. When creators miss clarity, it's not because they're lost, it's because clarity didn't look like what they expected. They were waiting for the "I'm ready" feeling instead of noticing the "I'm done forcing this" feeling. They were waiting for confidence to show up before they trusted alignment. But clarity is not a reward for certainty. Clarity is the starting point that guides you into the kind of consistency that feels like devotion instead of performance. And that's where the tide turns. Because once clarity is honored, once you stop dismissing whisper level truth just because it hasn't bloomed into shout level confidence, things begin to organize themselves. Ideas feel less chaotic, emotions settle, direction becomes less about guessing and more about sensing. Strategy stops feeling like pressure and becomes something that supports your actual lived reality. It steadies you. It directs you. It frees you. It roots you in honesty instead of obligation. Clarity creates the foundation consistency requires. And from that place, growth stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like possibility. As we continue this episode, I want you to sit with these next few questions. Where has quiet clarity already been speaking to you? What truth have you been calling confusion because it didn't feel certain yet? What part of your identity, your message, or your rhythm has already shifted without your permission? And what becomes possible when you stop forcing clarity to perform and instead let it inform? Now let these answers come softly. They don't need to be neat, but they do need to be true to who you are. One of the hardest truths to face, especially for creators, entrepreneurs, and anyone who has ever tried to build something from the ground up, is that clarity often doesn't feel safe at first. Not because it threatens you, but because it threatens the systems you've built when you didn't have clarity. The strategies you clung to, the routines you survived through, the identity you tried to maintain even when your spirit had already outgrown it. Clarity doesn't disrupt your life. It disrupts your coping mechanisms. And that's why so many people fear it. So let's get honest here. Clarity requires confrontation, not the loud external kind, but the quiet internal kind, where you finally admit something you've been avoiding, something you've pretended wasn't true, something you weren't ready to say out loud, something that would force you to look at your life, your work, your patterns, and your choices with an honesty that feels like peeling back the skin that's just too sensitive. Clarity forces you to look yourself in the eye. And for a lot of creators, including myself, that's terrifying. And it's not because they don't want alignment, but because alignment makes misalignment impossible to ignore. When clarity arrives, it highlights everything you've pushed through, everything you've tolerated, everything you've forced, everything you committed to out of fear rather than intention. It shows where your energy leaks, where your identity feels stretched thin, when your message isn't actually yours anymore, when your systems are supporting an outdated version of you. Clarity doesn't just guide, it exposes. And exposure requires courage. That's why when clarity starts whispering, people do the very thing they swear they don't want to do. they run back to consistency without context, back to routines, back to schedules, back to posting calendars, back to everything that gives the illusion of movement without requiring the vulnerability of change. Hustle culture has trained us to believe that as long as we are moving, we are progressing. But movement without direction is just motion. Motion without intention is just distraction. And distraction, disguised as productivity, will keep you stuck longer than confusion ever will. This is the emotional trap of consistency first thinking. It feels safe. It feels predictable. It feels like you're trying. It feels like you're showing up. It feels like you're doing the work. But if the work is disconnected from who you are, from your essence, your energy, your season, it's not work. It's performance. Consistency becomes a mask, a shield, a barrier between you and the clarity that's trying to lead you somewhere new. And here's the kicker. The more misaligned the consistency is, the more exhausted you become, which ironically makes you believe you need to be more consistent to fix it. A vicious cycle, a loop, a spiral that feels inescapable, a rhythm of self-blame disguised as discipline. But here's the truth nobody says out loud. Enough. Clarity doesn't drain you. Confusion does. Performance does. Pretending does. Clarity may make you feel uncomfortable at first, but clarity is never heavy. It's liberating. It's quiet. It's direction giving. It's grounding. Consistency without clarity feels like pressure. Consistency with clarity feels like devotion. One demands, the other supports. One shrinks you, the other steadies you. One requires perfection, the other requires presence. And when you start to understand that, when you truly let that sink into your bones, your relationship with growth begins to change. You stop running back to consistency for safety, and you start seeking clarity for direction. You stop forcing yourself to keep going, and you start asking, where am I actually going? And does this path honor who I am right now? Because the moment you start performing consistency and start practicing clarity, everything inside you begins to realign. Your energy softens. Your thinking sharpens. Your pace evens out. Your ambition shifts shape. From something frantic to something grounded. Clarity, when honored, creates a type of consistency you don't have to push for, and you don't have to force it. It becomes natural, embodied, rooted, aligned, and sustainable. And that's what we've been trying to build, right? Something we can actually stay with. Now, as you sit with this, I want you to ask yourself, what truth has been trying to get my attention that I keep avoiding because of what it might change? Where have I been performing consistency because it feels safe instead of choosing consistency because it feels aligned? What routines or commitments am I afraid to release because I don't know who I'll be without them? And what part of my creator identity is shifting? And what clarity is emerging underneath this discomfort? Let whatever rises surface slowly. There is no rush here. This is clarity doing its work. There's a very specific feeling that rises in your body when you're forcing consistency. And if you've lived in that state long enough, it becomes so familiar that you stop questioning it. You start treating heaviness as normal. You begin mistaking pressure for purpose. You assume the resistance you feel means you just need to try harder, push more, get stricter, be better, be stronger, be more disciplined. But force always leaves footprints. You can feel forced consistency in your jaw, the clenching, in your chest, the tightness, in your creativity, the reluctance, in your energy, the drain, in your thoughts, the constant self-negotiating, in your habits, the way you show up and then collapse afterward, in your spirit, the quiet ache of knowing when you're pretending. Forced consistency doesn't feel empowering. It feels like survival. It feels like enduring your own expectations. And when you're in that state long enough, you stop checking in with yourself altogether. You stop questioning whether your strategies still make sense. You stop evaluating whether your routines honor your season. You become loyal to systems that were never built for the version of you that exists right now. That loyalty isn't commitment. It's self-abandonment, wearing a disciplined mask. Most creators don't realize they're forcing consistency until they hit a wall of burnout, frustration, numbness, avoidance, or shame. A wall that makes them believe they failed, when the truth is that they've simply reached that point where misalignment can no longer be maintained. Forced consistency eventually collapses because it doesn't have anything real holding it up. But here's the part that matters. Forced consistency doesn't collapse to punish you. It collapses to free you. Because the moment it falls apart, clarity becomes unavoidable. You can't avoid clarity forever. Now, you may not know what the next step is yet, but you suddenly know that you can't continue. You know what can't be repeated. You know what you're tired of pretending fits. You know what your spirit is unwilling to carry one more day. That awareness, even if it comes through exhaustion, is clarity finally breaking through. So how do you recognize the early signs before you reach that wall? How do you catch yourself in the act of forcing so you can shift into flow instead? You notice the subtle thing. You notice the dread that creeps in before a task that used to feel neutral. You notice the way your body tightens before you hit post. You notice the guilt you feel on the days you don't show up, even when you're exhausted. You notice the shrinking, the internal flinch when someone suggests you just need to be more consistent. You notice the way you rush your creativity because you're scared of falling behind. You notice how relieved you feel when you imagine letting something go. Relief is one of the most honest forms of clarity. If the idea of stopping something brings you more peace than the idea of continuing it, that is clarity speaking louder than your performance ever could. And once you realize and recognize you've been forcing consistency, the solution isn't to quit everything or burn it all down. The solution is to pause long enough to understand the context. ESSENTFLOW is clearly led for a reason, because you cannot choose the right pace without knowing your position. So instead of asking yourself, how do I stay consistent? Ask, what is my current season asking of me? Flow is seasonal. Capacity is seasonal. Identity is seasonal. Creativity is seasonal. System, strategies, rhythms, all seasonal. When you stop forcing consistency and start honoring your season, everything becomes and begins to align without the emotional violence of pushing. This is where you shift from performance to presence. This is where you stop treating consistency like punishment. This is where you stop negotiating your fatigue. This is where you stop running from your own clarity. And this is where you begin practicing a different kind of consistency, one rooted with truth instead of pressure. Clarity doesn't just redirect your strategy, it reconnects you to yourself. And when you are connected to yourself, showing up becomes less about obligation and more about expression. You stop performing a creator identity and start embodying your creator identity. That's the difference between force and flow. Force demands, flow supports. Force pressures, flow aligns. Force drains, flow sustains. And when consistency is built from flow, it becomes something you can stay with, not something you're constantly trying to survive. Now sit with this slowly, okay? Where am I repeating something my body has already released? What would happen if I traded forced consistency for honest clarity? What version of myself is emerging when I stop performing and start listening? These questions are meant to push you. They're meant to guide you because clarity isn't asking you to move faster. It's asking you to move true. There comes a moment in every creator's journey where you realize that the problem was never consistency. It was never discipline. It was never your willingness to work or your desire to grow. It was never that you weren't trying hard enough. The real issue was that you were trying to build consistency on top of a foundation that didn't fit you anymore. And the moment clarity steps in, the moment you stop demanding certainty and start honoring truth, something shifts inside you that can't be undone. You stop treating your growth like a race. You stop treating your creativity like a factory. You stop treating yourself like a machine that needs to be optimized. Clarity brings you back into your humanity. And from that place, consistency stops feeling like something you beat yourself into. It becomes something you practice with intention, compassion, and alignment. This is the part of the journey where flow stops being a concept and becomes a lived experience. Because flow is not passive. Flow is not go with the wind. Flow is not whatever happens, happens. Flow is clarity in motion. Flow is knowing who you are, what season you're in, what matters most right now. What matters most right now and what your capacity can hold, and then choosing your actions from that place of truth. Flow is consistency with context. Flow is discipline with direction. Flow is strategy with soul. When clarity leads, flow follows. And when flow follows, growth becomes sustainable. You don't have to force inspiration anymore. You don't have to fight with your energy. You don't have to drag yourself through different routines that make you resent your own creativity. Instead, you start moving with yourself, not against yourself. Your messaging sharpens because you're no longer speaking from obligation. You're speaking from essence. Your content becomes richer because you're no longer creating to keep up. You're creating to express. Your systems become supportive because they reflect the real season you're in, not the imagined one you wish you were in, or the one someone else said you should be in. And the most beautiful part, your growth begins to feel intentional again, not reactive or frantic or driven by fear or scarcity or comparison. Intentional, aligned, rooted, steady, yours. This is the moment where everything you've learned, everything you've processed from episode 11 into this conversation right now begins to converge into one truth. Clarity gives your growth somewhere to land. Flow gives your growth the space to breathe. Consistency gives your growth the rhythm to sustain itself. When clarity is the starting point, flow becomes the strategy. And when flow becomes the strategy, Consistency becomes the outcome, not the demand. This is the beginning of sustainable creation. This is the ESSENTFLOW way. And now, you're stepping into a new chapter where clarity won't just shape your decisions. It will shape your brand, your message, your pace, your systems, and ultimately, the kind of creator you become. Flow isn't something you chase. Flow is something you cultivate. And it all starts right here in the honesty of naming what's true for you. And as we close, I really want you to let this sit with you. What clarity have you been carrying quietly that you're finally willing to honor? What would your growth look like if you could let clarity, not pressure, decide your pace? What version of you becomes possible when consistency is no longer forced, but aligned? Let those answers be enough for today. Allow them to be enough for you, and let them be the first step of your next season. You for tuning in to ESSENTFLOW by Intentional by Shay, where clarity becomes the cornerstone of your sustainable creator growth. Thank you for spending this time with me today, love. If this episode helped you see yourself more honestly, breathe a little deeper, or make sense of what's been feeling heavy, that's clarity doing its job. Next week, we're expanding this conversation even further as we step into a new layer of strategy, one that helps you recognize the season you're in and how to choose practices that actually fit your life. Until then, honor your peace, honor your pace, trust your clarity, and remember, your growth doesn't need force, it just needs to flow. See you in the next episode.